Suraj, your presence is requested in the front of the room, please.
I do it.
Absolutely.
Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you here this evening to this amazing opportunity. I know that many of you hail from different parts of the Kennedy School, the campus, and I think that this is a rare opportunity to both combine the wisdom of fellows from both students and senior leaders of various initiatives on campus, and a legend, a literal living legend here at Harvard. So I'm humbled to have a chance to help to guide this conversation. I get to run my mouth a lot. I've been running it a lot over the last 36 hours. So this is an opportunity really to hear from this panel, and it's incredible. Let me go through a couple of framing statements. So we are here, just in case you are in the wrong room or on the wrong flight, for Dismantling Racism, Casteism, Similar Struggles for Justice, Equality, and Dignity of Historically Oppressed Groups, a seminar series newly formed here at Harvard University. For centuries, racist or casteist ideologies have overlapped in the oppression of African Americans, Dalits, Romani people, and many, many others. The racecraft of inferiority continues to be a powerful ideological weapon that ruling elites and dominant majorities have been using intentionally and unintentionally, overtly and covertly against historically oppressed groups. This series aims to create a space for solidarity and partnership among activists, scholars, community leaders involved in similar struggles across the world. Voices belonging to various minority and marginalized groups will discuss opportunities and tactics to connect, share, and stand together over the course of the series as programming evolves. The series is a joint initiative of Dr. Magda. I don't know if I've ever pronounced your last name. Can you tell? Matache. Dr. Magda Matache, who runs the Harvard FXB Center for Health and Human Rights, and Dr. Suraj Yengde, who is here at the Harvard Kennedy School as part of the Initiative for Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability. Now that's the spirit.
Mr. Winnie's in the house. Yeah, we love you, we love you.
And so this is our inaugural event with regard to participating and hosting for the initiative, which is nicknamed IRA, this evening. Let me also introduce, of course, Dr. Cornel West, who is perhaps the leading transnational anti-racist scholar of our time. Has been in the trenches for nearly half a century, has been both among the most fearless and courageous scholars, but has also put his words and his body on the line in the interest of transnational racial justice. And we are deeply indebted for his courage and his humanism, his commitment to justice, to love, to compassion, and to seeing all of God's children. And so please join me and my name is Khalil Gibran. I'm here on faculty at the Harvard Kennedy School. So I'm going to open this up shortly with a couple of questions, and the panel will respond. But I thought it was really important because this panel is held together by a concept that is not universally known. And indeed, it's one of the harder concepts that my students and even I struggle with in class. And so because the framing uses this term racecraft, I thought it important to define the term, particularly by the person who developed it. Barbara Fields and Karen Fields are two scholars, one, Barbara, a historian, Karen, her sister, a sociologist, published a book a few years ago called Racecraft, but the work itself grew out of an article in the New Left Review, published in 1998. And I'm going to read a little bit from it. It won't take very long. But I think it's important because I want you to wrestle with the concept in a way that I think will inform how you listen and hear what our panelists will have to say, will be saying. So here goes that. I bookmarked this in my Kindle. Now it's looking very strange back at me and not quite where the bookmark. Hold on, here we go. Here we go. Racial ideology in its radical American form is the ideology to be expected in a society in which enslavement stands as an exception to a radically defined liberty, so commonplace that no great effort of imagination is required to take it for granted. It is the ideology proper to a free society in which the enslaved descendants of Africans are an anomalous exception. There is no paradox. It makes good common sense. Indeed, I dare go further. In the wake of the American Revolution, racial ideology assumed its greatest importance in the free bourgeois society of the northern states, where both slavery and the presence of Afro-Americans became increasingly minor exceptions. The paroxysms of racist violence that convulsed the South during the years after emancipation and the even more detailed legal codification of racist prescription represent the nationalization of race, an ideology that described the bourgeois North much better than it did the slave South. Now, let me back up one section. I am sorry, here we go. Ideology is best understood as the descriptive vocabulary of day-to-day existence, through which people make rough sense of the social reality they live and create from day to day. It is the language of consciousness that suits the particular way in which people deal with their fellows. Ideologies are real, but it does not follow that they are scientifically accurate or that they provide an analysis of social relations that would make sense to anyone who does not take ritual part in those relations. Some societies, including colonial New England, have explained troublesome relations between people as witchcraft and possession by the devil. The explanation makes sense to those who daily live lives that produce and reproduce witchcraft, nor can any amount of rational evidence disprove it. Witchcraft in such a society is as self-evident or as natural a fact is as race is to many of us today. To someone looking in from outside, however, explaining a miscarriage, crop failure, a sudden illness, or death by invoking witchcraft would seem absurd, as explaining slavery by invoking race must seem absurd to anyone who does not ritually produce race day in and day out as Americans do. Ideologies do not need to be plausible, let alone persuasive to outsiders. They do their job when they help insiders make sense of the things they do and see, ritually, repetitively, on a daily basis. And then lastly, racial ideology supplied the means of explaining slavery to people whose terrain was a republic founded on radical doctrines of liberty and natural rights. And more important, a republic in which those doctrines seemed to represent accurately the world in which all but a minority lived. Only when the denial of liberty became an anomaly apparent even to the least observant and reflective members of Euro-American society did ideologies systematically explain the anomaly. But slavery got along for 100 years after its establishment without race as its ideological rationale. The reason is simple. Race explained why some people could be rightly denied what others took for granted, namely liberty, supposedly a self-evident gift of nature's God. So the takeaway is that race is an explanation for the oppression that was baked into the entire project of slavery from the very beginning. The problem from the beginning was the need to oppress and then the need to explain away the oppression because of the doctrine of liberal democracy or republic of natural rights inhered in every individual. Therefore, those individuals could not embody their full humanity and therefore could not be citizens because otherwise they could not be enslaved. And we have been living with the consequences, according to Fields, of Racecraft ever since. And so it is in that spirit that we open up the conversation. So here's the opening question for our panelists, and I hope they take it each at a time. What are some of the tactics in which Racecraft or Castecraft have been effectively used against your communities throughout history?
Thank you. We should also acknowledge Brother Khalil because his leadership here at the Kennedy School has really provided an energy and new direction for the people who are desperate to find humanity that has been in its vacuum and also getting lost into this neoliberal formations of how we end up forming democracy. So your presence here, brother, is very important, and I'm very proud to be here. Also, I would like to acknowledge my excellent team, IRA, Initiative for Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability. Miriam is there, Erika is there, and Carrie, somewhere here. The idea of, people are always confused with, the notions of race and caste, and there is always this dialectic almost kind of way how you address this. And so if you are in Western society engaging with the white culture, predominantly Caucasian, you end up kind of demonizing the people who are from the darker races, so to say. And so by default, if you come in contact with the white society, and you being Indian or any other person, you also become part of that darker race. But history in America is very complicated. They have been arbitrarily engaging with the notions of race, how race forms, and actually it kind of evolves and then gets back. So at one point, the Indians who come here are considered whites, and they're being given naturalized, and they become Americans because they kind of prove their Aryan ancestry. And through this, you can see the kind of white supremacy thought that has been animating the lives of Indians who were of a certain stock, claimed their ancestry or their relation to the people who were belonging or who were actually ruling in America. Now what happens is, as this happened a decade or two later, this kind of, again, some racial scientists come forward, because of course this was the time when anthropometry was deciding. Your nasal index was one of the indicators of how much of white you are or how much of black you are, and where we can weigh in. So the racist American society then went on and said, you know what, Indians, you're not white. So we will revoke your naturalized citizenship. So there's a actually case in US. And so when we look at this, we are actually looking at a phenomenon that is actually not being addressed enough through research, through public conversations, through media, which is, why do Indians so desperately want it to be white? Now, one of the questions is because you don't want it to be black. And second thing is you don't want to be lower. And the people who claim their superiority were people who belong to a dominant caste in India. They've been trained for 3,000 plus years to oppress their own kinds. And so when Gandhi, for example, goes to South Africa, he has to be kicked out of the first-class cabin to realize his non-white privilege. Now that's how audacious it gets. A person who comes from privileges, travels to work in certain vocation, has to encounter a white, sort of a white nationhood in South Africa, and then he realizes this is a problem. He doesn't realize that problem exists in his own country, in his own backyard, in his own kitchen and his own gardens and in his own fields and farms. So this is the kind of sidelining of the people who belong to the so-called lower castes, or in larger terms, the Dalits become invisibilized in their own experiences. So we don't know. So what happens as we proceed, the racial categories keep on changing, but the caste as a social system does have a purchase in American South, where the American South system was known as racial caste system. And in the early 20th century onwards, we see these are the debates that have been taking place. And of course, we see with the work of Michelle Alexander, who identifies the people who are not very much acceptable to society, but who are also underdogs. She calls her the undercastes, the new castes of the American system, which is the incarcerated people. And we, of course, know through the work of Condemnation and also the 13th documentary that we come to face this reality as to these people who exist among us, but they don't inform our own liberal consciousness. Because for our liberal consciousness only exists when you have an engagement with someone. And if you don't have engagement with someone through media or non-media, those people don't exist. And then that's where our eureka moment becomes, oh my God, this is not what I thought. And this kind of epiphany that we keep on witnessing. So across the world, we have close to 300 million people who are oppressed by caste. You're born in a caste, and you die in a caste. You suffer in a caste, and you only suffer in the caste. And the idea of caste system primarily comes from a Brahminical Hindu system, which authorizes for its own people to be enslaved. There have been laws that have been promoting the ascending kind of respect, to use Ambedkar, and to have a descending contempt. So the lower you go, the more contempt you have. Within this way, when you come here, for example, to very example, in our own room, we end up engaging and talking, have friends who are from mostly South Asian origin. And single-handedly no one will talk about, or if they do, it's a very kind of distant analysis, or they would even not engage on the question of caste. It's almost equivalent to the white South Africans during the apartheid era when they went to study overseas. They never talked about racial problem. They all gave the propaganda picture of apartheid South Africa. Similar and equivalent picture we see here when people glorify the kind of existence of Indian vibrant democracy. It is not a democracy. To use Malcolm X, it's a hypocrisy. Because people are disenfranchised. People can't vote. The Muslim population in India, the Adivasi, the tribal people, and the Dalits are heavily marginalized. They are unable to participate in this democracy. So what we do is we buy a certain New York Times kind of neoliberal engagement of this problem, which is very serious and which is very ingrained for so many years that we don't even want to talk about it. And why do you not want to talk about it? Because it will expose your own privilege. Because here in a white society, like 150 or 120 years ago, what happened was you claim your whiteness. And now here, when it's almost becoming as an Olympics of oppression, so you want to appear a person who's on a lower scale. To kind of, and by doing that, what you do is indirectly kind of take over the oppression of people who are really oppressed, who have been here and who have been facing everyday brutality. But what happens is if in this class you talk about certain ideas, you end up being part of the narrative, which is not necessarily related to you. So many times across this Harvard actually bubble, but Harvard Kennedy School too, we barely have anyone engaging as critically about the question that affects 300 million people. And so we need to ask, where is the buck stopping? Who is benefiting out of this? And if this is something that we need to take forward, is Harvard Kennedy School will authorize people who are benefiting out of this privilege to be the leaders of the society. And by default, it engages in reproducing oppression. And that's where the problem lies. And now what you want to do is you want to use the diversity. You want to put some cosmetic colors in this room and you want to appear good while retaining the structures of oppression. And so When Indians come here, they also come under this diversity program. Back home, their own brothers and sisters are oppressing their own maids, their own servants, their own people who work on their farms, on lowest paying jobs. So their affirmative action policy is heavily condemned. It's a meritocratic society. So people who come to Harvard come under the pretension that we are meritocratic. They don't understand that when the application has been assessed, it's not meritocracy that is working there. So the society that promotes this kind of values, while at the same time undermines the voices of people who are on the lower scale, is something we are witnessing in this. And I think the question of racecraft becomes very important. The way I look at it is, it's the mechanism to invisibilize the presence of people, to self-pity that your position in that lower order is because you are not capable enough, or we just gave you all the opportunities. We have quotas, and then you still want to cry. And the problem is, now let's go with the figures. 71% of Dalits are landless laborers. They work on someone's farm, 71%. And if you're working on someone's farm in a feudal casteist society in India, you are tied to that person for generations. If you go to any farm, or because India is agricultural country, right? More than 70% of India is agriculture based. That's why I give an example of land. Dalits, less than 3% of Dalits, which are actually, as I gave you the number in India, if you compare, it's about 240. Of them, less than 3% graduate with a university degree. So here's the maths. We have a quota for Dalits, about 16-17%. Less than 3% of them graduate. So they're not even able to, proportional to their population. And we still see there is a backlash within this heavy-headed system. And because of this, even if there is a person who is Dalit amongst us, we have not given him or her an opportunity to be who she or he is. We have totally withdrawn that humanity of her. We have totally withdrawn the experiences of her ancestors. And what we are trying to present is that you being here is you have to be normal like us. You can't bring your own experiences here because we are not used to having here. We are used to seeing you somewhere in the farm or somewhere in our maids.
Could you describe some of the just basic forms of caste norms that are present in 2019 with regard to entering homes from the back door, not being able to break bread together? Because I know that to some degree, that obviously there's a slant to the American story here because many of these students are US students. But things that we know to have been true for the Jim Crow period, even with all the systemic racism exists, are not acceptable in most instances, but in India, very much. So maybe just describe a couple of those things.
Jim Crow, as people here would like to believe in America, that it was a thing of the past, right? And so, but in India, if you think about 100 years ago America, we will see that happening right now. So if a person who is belonging to a lower caste or the Dalit untouchable caste, he or she most likely is working in a person of dominant caste in a lower paying or whatever, job which are usually considered as impure or with filth. So you can't enter the house from the front door, you have to enter through the back, this kind of backdooring. One of the instances, even if you go to villages, the taste or the purity is so maintained that the untouchables are put outside the village. So they are not in contact and they are in minority. And so if they have to fetch water and if they have to go and access basic amenities in the village, they have to walk. The access to school, as I was giving statistics, is extremely limited. 69% of Dalit kids get into school when they are in 6 to 14 years old. By the time they are 24 plus, less than 8% are there. So we see a systematic kind of structure that is imposing its values upon its own citizens, and that's why if I raise an issue this, I'm an anti-national. Because the question of my nationality becomes very important. And so many times if I'm against the nation, if I'm against the people who are handlers of the nation, they don't want me to have that space to air my grievance, to air my disagreement. Because I'm very afraid the next moment they will declare me anti-national and I'm citizen of no state.
They went to the Kennedy School of Government, right? Yeah.
True.
Can we open up space for Dr. Magda to join the conversation?
Yes.
Sure. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. I am honored and very, very nervous to join this panel tonight. But I'm also hopeful and grateful that we are able to continue our conversation about solidarity and friendships, perhaps not yet between our movements and people, but at least between a group of scholars who are able to, and also willing to create this space of conversations, solidarity, and also ideas on how we can fight systems of oppression and how we can fight repression against various minority groups across the world. But to get back to your question, Professor Mohammed, I think that the idea or the concept of racecraft, as has been constructed by Karen and Barbara Fields, does help us to better understand the mechanics, the mechanisms, and also the tactics of oppression, not only for Black Americans, but also for Romani people in Europe or Dalit people in India. And I'll get back to a definition that you provided yesterday to racecraft, which I think gathers a little bit more clearly what this concept means. And I think that Professor Mohammed said yesterday that racecraft is a deployment of ideas to justify racism. And I do want to keep that in mind while I give you a few examples of racecraft in the case of Roma population. And I'll start with a very basic one, which is the racecraft of gypsy criminality. And this racecraft has been so deeply rooted in so many cultures that even today in the US we use the phrase to be gypped, originating in the slur gypsy, to communicate some sort of criminal activity. But I won't talk about the racecraft of criminality tonight, and I do hope that you touch upon it in your intervention, because racecraft has not been, or the racecraft of criminality has not been just a tactic against Romani people, that has been as much of a tactic used against Black Americans. But I do want to talk about a different racecraft. The racecraft of a gypsy culture that doesn't value education. A racist imaginary, if you want, that has been influencing not only policymakers and teachers' behaviors in schools, in the classrooms, but also the Romani ideas, actions, and also views. So after I took Professor Mohammed's class last semester, I started to work with a group of scholars, with Tanya Jovanovic and Simona Barbu, on a paper in which we basically challenge the racecraft of an uneducated people. And what we argue is that education has not been a choice for Romani children when the public education system was put in place. And education was not an option for Roma when it became available to many. And education, it is denied today to many Romani children and youth across Europe, although I think the racecraft and also the action of racism, the tactic, has been a little bit more sophisticated these days. And we believe that it is important to have this conversation, because virtually no study until today looks at the relationship, the nexus between the history of public education and the denial and the rejection of Romani children from the educational systems. So I do dare to say that when education or public education was invented in Europe, it was designed as an institution for Gaje. That's the word that we use in our language for non-Roma, although it was not so much so for white girls and for the poor. but yet it was not a functional option for Romani children and youth. And I'll give you two examples to prove my claim. One is from 1927, in the era of eugenics, when academics and policymakers used scientific racism and biological determination as justifications to place Romani children in special schools designed only for Roma in Czechoslovakia. And these justifications that basically said that Romani children are inferior and also undesirable have been used over and over again until today in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, Serbia, all across Europe, and they have this moral reinforcement, as Barbara Field would call it, that stays in this idea of Romani inferiority. The second example comes from Serbia. The Serbian educational system started to put its basis sometimes in the end of 1800s. But it wasn't until the beginning of, I think, the 20th century when Serbia had schools all over the country. But this was a moment that coincided more or less with the moment when the idea of Roma as an inferior race was also rising in Europe, and it was intertwined, if you want, with the killings of Roma, but also the rejection of Roma in the educational system, and the Yugoslav government was a good example in that, was an example in that sense. For instance, during the Holocaust, about 20,000 Romani people were killed by the Yugoslav government, but also in the beginning of 40s, there were a set of measures that are known as the 22 articles that targeted Romani people and Jewish people. And I'll give you a few examples of some of these articles. One of the articles basically stated that Romani people and Jewish people should wear a yellow armband that would distinguish them from the majority Serbian population. Another article would require local authorities, Serbian local authorities, to separate the Roma and the Jews from the majority Serbian population. And perhaps most importantly for this discussion on racecraft or the racecraft of an inferior people, another article stated that schools should deny the access and the enrollment of Roma and Jews in schools, and no Roma and no Jews should be allowed to enter college. Wow. So basically this is an example of how racecraft was somehow built in Serbia, but it was not just that. So during the communist times, but also post-communism, until recently and until today, basically this the racecraft has been reimagined and reshaped over and over again, until today, when Romani children are placed in special schools based on a diagnosis of mental disability, and they are disproportionately placed there. And there is a whole conversation here about segronomics, right? We discussed this in class, because the whole special education system does benefit a lot from the participation of these children in those classrooms, because otherwise the special education system would not exist. But what I'm trying to say is that from the beginning of the education, public education in Europe, white Europeans or white Europe, not to put the blame on people but on the system, really didn't want us to benefit from equal education. What they wanted us to, they wanted to civilize us. And this is a term that Maria Teresa back in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1800s really made it very clear. They wanted to civilize us. And by that, they meant then and they mean now to teach us how to read and how to write, but not to go to college. to have us clean their houses, take care of their babies, harvest their land, but not own property. And even to have us help their academic or humanitarian work in our own communities, but not necessarily to be too loud, too vocal, too demanding, too opinionated about those ideas. And I'll stop here by saying that indeed for too long now, the racecraft of inferiority, the racecraft of an uneducated people, the racecraft of criminality have served as moral reinforcements for the justification of racialized communities, racialized poverty, racialized education, racialized punishment, racialized policing, and racialized rights.
Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Definitely. Well, I first say I'm very blessed to be here at the Kennedy School and be once again in dialogue with my dear sister and my dear brother, Magda and Suraj. I've been blessed to write op-ed pieces with each of them, trying to express the depths of my own soul, a solidarity with Dalit peoples and a solidarity with Roma peoples. As someone who comes out of a particular tradition of a hated people who's taught the world so much about how to love veritas, truth and beauty and goodness. I think the answer to my dear brother's question, the distinguished scholar, I have great love and respect for this brother, that the best answer to the question is in the best book written in the last 25 years about the vicious legacy in the American empire, and it's called The Condemnation of Blackness. It's published in 2010. And it has everything to do with first where we begin, because he and I come out of the same tradition, which is we first acknowledge that a Roma baby, a Dalit baby, a black baby, a Tibetan baby, a Jewish baby, a Palestinian baby, an Ethiopian baby, a Guatemalan baby, a white, a black, a red, a yellow, a Catholic, a Jew, whatever it is, they all have the same value. They all have the same significance. And you have to believe that. Because if you really believe that, then you're going to be fired up to keep track of what loses track with their humanity. You begin with empire. You begin with predatory capitalism. You begin with white supremacy. You begin with patriarchy. You begin with homophobia, transphobia, anti-Jewish hatred, anti-Arab hatred, anti-Muslim hatred, losing sight of the humanity of those in traditional religions. These are not just abstract moral principles. They are inscribed in one soul craft that allows you to combat vicious forms of racecraft. You cannot talk about racecraft without talking about fight back. Now, I'm here with a very, very heavy heart today. Because my dear brother, my mentor, when I arrived at 17 years old at Harvard, died this morning. His name was Martin Luther Kilson. He was the first black professor tenured in the history of Harvard. Harvard been around since 1636, and he was tenured in 1969. That's how vicious the legacy of white supremacy is in shaping this institution. And he opened his heart and his mind and his soul because he had a father named Reverend Martin Luther Kilson Sr., the AME pastor, that taught him, when you go to Harvard, when you go to that predominantly white space, don't sell your soul. Don't lose yourself in a largely vanilla context where you'll be so eager to try to adjust and adapt that lo and behold, the very legacy that enabled you to achieve where you are will be lost. And solidarity to any oppressed people is a way of reminding yourself that is the best in you. I told my dear brother Khalil when he came to the Kennedy School, I said, "You too deep for this place, man. You need to know that. I've been around Harvard for a long time. You much too deep for this place. They're going to have to study your chapter on racial liberalism. They're going to have to zero in on your